To be here, and we're going to start in a bit. Everyone get comfortable. If you want to get some water to drink, some tea, do that. We will have a very interesting panel today. We have one person joining us online, Nishan. We're going to start a session with a couple of presentations, and we will open it up for Q&A. And afterwards, we have a broader Q&A conversation across all the different presentations that we will hear. I think it is very important to note that today's conversation is going to focus really much around climate risk and climate justice. And as a youth activist, we use the word climate justice a lot. And sometimes people wonder, what does climate justice actually mean? And in the context of climate risk, I think it makes it easier to break it down. And from my perspective, and I believe that the panelists will hold their own perspectives as well, but from my perspective, it's really the fact that the climate crisis is here, but we do not need to have the unequal impact of it, and we do not need to suffer loss of life significantly from this, because the crisis itself does not automatically equate to loss of life. So when floods or hurricanes or cyclone happens in two different geographical locations, the impacts are different. On one side, based on reinforced infrastructure, resources available, you might be able to respond a bit much faster and be able to protect life. And in other places, that is not the case. And while we work towards reducing emission, carbon capture, carbon removals, and we talk about mitigation a lot, we are also realizing that the impacts are increasing, they're intensifying, and communities are at risk. And if we really want to have justice served to everyone, we need to protect those who are really seeing those impacts. And that means that we need to explore all potential options in terms of funding, research, resources, skills development that allow us as a global community to protect those who are on the front lines. So I'll start today's presentation, today's session with a presentation from Ricardo. Ricardo is the Executive Director for Sustenta, which is in Honduras. And I've known Ricardo for a while, and I think what is really impressive is, as a young activist working in the government, but also having the chance to develop the decarbonization plan. As a young negotiator, he comes on this panel with a lot of experience and skills to share with us. So I'll hand over to Ricardo, and afterwards, I'll pass it over to Dan, who would also come and make a presentation. So Ricardo, over to you now. Thanks.
Thank you, Joshua, and thanks to everyone that is here. Normally, youth activists like me would, we have different ways to start these types of panels, and with being here in the Ocean Pavilion, a normally very serious place where we're going to be talking about technologies and a lot of groundbreaking work, I wanted to start on a perhaps less serious note and more of a personal story that kind of shaped my way here. So what you're seeing in the screen is our beautiful Roatan, Honduras. I don't know if anyone has been there. If not, well, I'm not going to condone cruise ships right now, but I'm just going to say it's a really wonderful experience for tourism. And I went there and I organized a space with my high school colleagues because I wanted to see this. I wanted to see the different coral reefs. I wanted to see all the biodiversity, but there's a little problem with that. I don't know how to swim, okay? So I did my best, and honestly, at that time, I was not a climate activist. I did not even know that, much about what climate change was, but I was very certain about one thing. And I remember I told this to my girlfriend at the time, I want to see the coral reefs before they're gone. And again, it was really difficult. First time, I completely failed. The second time, I had to get the instructor helping me, some floaties. I was able to finally do some snorkeling. But what I saw was this. This is what is currently happening in Honduras and in many of our coral reefs. And this is, of course, coral bleaching, and is particularly causing because of temperature rise and because of the warming oceans. Now, I'm not here to, I think everyone knows this. This is the Ocean Pavilion. So I'm going to talk more into what this actually means for Honduras or for communities like my country, and what we can do about it. Because as a climate activist, I focus a lot on not talking much about the problems, but really talking about what potential solutions we might have. So the biggest problem with warming oceans is that they exacerbate vulnerabilities, especially for already vulnerable countries like Honduras. For example, as you can see here, the Honduran shrimp industry has suffered tremendous losses due to, for example, heavy rains, or in the case of hurricanes. Warming oceans, well, they strengthen the intensity and, of course, the occurrence of hurricanes, which is also impacting the lives of fishermen, and even many of the, for example, crabs are also, and other crustaceans are also being affected by the warming oceans due to their ability to, strengthen their own shells, etc. We also have a lot of communities in Honduras, which I have spoken in the past about, that are facing currently increasing sea level rise, and this is only taking blocks of their families, blocks of their houses, blocks of their restaurants, and all of their infrastructure away due to the rising water. And particularly hurricanes. Just 2 years ago, Honduras got 2 Category 4 hurricanes in a span of 10 days, and that caused economic damages that equaled 40% of the country's GDP. So imagine our country just having to touch that reset button every time we get a hurricane when it comes to our economy. So warming oceans is definitely a problem for countries that are vulnerable as ours. This is something that the World Economic Forum posted recently. Of course, there have been many different specific values around it, but around 99% coral reefs can be lost in a 1.5 degree Celsius degree future. And I know that this is particularly important because we all heard what happened with the UNEP report, the emissions gap report, that said there are no credible pathways to 1.5. So how can we get these two things together? And for me, as a young climate activist, let me be clear. If 1.5 is not doable, then our next goal should be 1.51. We're not going to settle for 2 degrees. We're not going to settle, especially for countries like Honduras. But again, I'm here to talk about solutions, and particularly what I see as a very ground-to-earth solutions for countries that already don't have the time, that are already facing these disasters, is that climate interventions, especially through research, especially through Global South-led discussions, can be a very potential, highly rapidable and scalable deployment that could dampen warming, not only, of course, for the well-being of our own atmosphere, but as well for the oceans, right? First thing first, hurricanes. I just mentioned this, and but also sea level rise. There's just some of the effects that could be mitigated when it comes to climate interventions, which I know the rest of the panelists are going to get into much more detail. Also, other opportunities are also economic opportunities. For example, access to carbon markets. I take one of the words from one of my colleagues from Africa that said, conservation without funding. Conservation without funding is just conversation. And for me, that's key. For me, that's key. Because what we're talking about is like, we need to use these types of solutions. For example, I know that the colleague from the World Economic, for the World Research Institute is also going to be speaking about different opportunities to capture carbon within the oceans. And what we really need is that these types of solutions can actually be used to conserve biodiversity, that these resources are going to be, in the end, taken forward towards the protection of our own oceans. And of course, this could also be a potential entry for more marine protected areas. And I just want to finish up here. I do think we need enabling conditions. And before leaving off the panel, I want to really focus on 3 things. First, research, research, and research. Research is key to knowing how climate interventions are going to be applicable, what their effects are going to be, and in the end, how plausible are they going to be as a solution, especially for vulnerable countries like mine. So I put research as number 1, but for me, research is everything when talking about these solutions. Second of all, these discussions have to be Global South-led. I'm here talking to you, talking about my own experience, but the realities of Honduras is not the same as the realities that we're facing, for example, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, etc. And it's key that we have these types of Global South-led discussions when it comes to these types of solutions. And third, Joshua was just saying, this is all about equity and climate justice. This is about the fishermen that are there. This is about the people from my country that I'm representing, and this is all about the people that already are facing these solutions and that do not have the time. With that, I wanted to open up this panel, but thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. I think it's very scary for me if I see a slide that says there are no credible pathways to 1.5. It is scary. And I like what you said, that if you cannot achieve 1.5, then the target should be 1.51. And that is to say that we cannot give up, because we know that there are possibilities to achieve that and to reach that. And I think that really seizes us to the next session. I'm going to invite Dan Lashow from WRI as a director for US. And WRI is a huge institution that do a lot of work on climate. But I think on a personal level, you've been pushing for climate solutions for over decades. And when you see a slide like that, what does it mean to you? When you see a slide as someone who has been working for decades on this topic, and knowing that we are at a very sort of critical moment in time. Of course, negotiations are going on, but we don't have time. So I'm very keen from a solution perspective, what is going on within your organization, what are your perspectives, and I think fundamentally, I would like to pick all of your thoughts as well on that slide which said there's no credible way to 1.5. What would that mean to the world if we do not really get to that? So Dan, thank you so much for joining us, and please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And yeah, I would say it would be a lot easier to get to 1.5 if we had acted more vigorously decades ago when some of us started this. But from my perspective, we think 1.5 is still something we need to focus on. And I would say there's no credible, is actually a good introduction, because there's no credible pathway to 1.5 that doesn't include carbon removal, which is why we're now developing a body of research and policy around carbon removal. And so this is a sort of simplified version of the various spaghetti diagrams you might see from the IPCC. But basically, we need to reduce emissions absolutely as quickly as possible. But to get to 1.5, we also need to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Multiple ways to do that. Most of the attention has been about carbon removal from land, but the ocean is 70% of the Earth's surface and actually has 50 times more carbon than the atmosphere. So we have to also consider the possibility of employing the ocean as a way to help remove carbon from the atmosphere. And it is starting to get more attention. Countries' net zero pledges necessitate carbon removal because there are very difficult to abate sectors. I would point to aviation, some agricultural emissions. So if you're going to get to net zero, carbon removal has to be a part of the equation. But with respect to the ocean, we have a lot of uncertainty, a lack of a clear framework for thinking about it or governance structure. So we think it's urgent to move forward to improve our understanding of these technologies and develop an approach that gets buy-in from the communities that are affected and the global community at the same time so that we can move this forward. So one thing we've done is look at the long-term strategies that have been submitted under the Framework Convention process and the Paris Agreement. About 50 have been submitted, and about half of them talk about carbon removal as a component of their long-term strategies. Most of those are not explicit about ocean versus land-based carbon removal, but the United States and Japan specifically do mention ocean carbon removal as one of the possible elements of achieving their net zero targets. There's also increasing private interest, both in research and companies that are thinking about deployment. And it's great to have that private sector interest in this topic, but that also means we need to get ahead of that with a research program and a governance system that can provide some norms and approaches that ensure there are guardrails around how that's deployed. And when it comes to ocean carbon removal compared with, say, land-based carbon removal, there are additional complexities because most of the ocean-based carbon removal would happen in the high seas beyond jurisdictional boundaries. Monitoring and verification is a challenge simply because the ocean moves. So carbon that sinks in one area is going to move someplace else. And there's challenges of determining how much of that carbon is going to be permanently removed from the atmosphere, and that's a critical point to know whether that really is contributing to staying on a 1.5 pathway or getting onto a 1.5 pathway. Also, it's essential to incorporate the equity and social implications, climate justice implications. 10% of the population relies on the ocean for food and employment, and 95% of those people live in the global south. So what we do in the ocean, or what we fail to do in the ocean to protect it, is a critical issue in terms of climate justice. And so when we think about that, and we think about should we move forward with ocean carbon removal, it's, in our view, very much a risk-risk calculation. So there are clearly risks associated with deploying ocean carbon removal, and they need to be better understood. I'll talk more about that. But there are massive risks in failing to get on a 1.5 pathway. And those risks are beyond the ocean, but certainly include massive impacts on the ocean in terms of ocean acidification, the higher temperature impacts, the coral bleaching that we saw so graphically illustrated. It was great to be in the Red Sea on Sunday, so I had a chance to dive on this amazing coral reef. I know we all want to see it protected, but it is a real challenge for coral reefs, not only here but around the world. So we want to move forward with informed and responsible development of ocean carbon removal approaches. What does that mean? I think a key point is that it has to be an iterative process. There's a real need to start experimental deployments, not deployments, but field experiments where we're actually at small scales, but in the ocean, testing different approaches. That needs to be done in a responsible way, but without that, we're never going to gain the knowledge to know whether larger scale deployment is feasible. But those small scale experiments need to be done in a framework that ensures that community concerns are taken into account and that they're, very importantly, monitored very carefully with transparency and reporting of what happens, so there's learning from that, and that those experiments are to advance knowledge for the global community and not just to advance commercial interests of any particular company or individual state that might be moving forward with those in the near term. So let's talk a little bit about what the actual options are for carbon removal, because it can mean a lot of different things, and the risks and benefits vary dramatically. I would say none of these are fully understood or well enough understood to support large-scale deployment at this time, but we do know a little bit about some of these. So starting from abiotic approaches like electrochemical carbon dioxide removal, alkalinity enhancement, moving to the right-hand side, maybe it's the left-hand side, depending on how you're looking at it, on coastal wetlands restoration. A range of approaches with a range of potential impacts. So I'll talk just briefly about each of these. So one of the most no-regret strategy that is being practiced, and there's potential, for much more here in coastal blue carbon. It's has a lot of benefits for the community in terms of protecting the coastline, supporting biodiversity. But unfortunately, its overall carbon removal potential in terms of how many gigatons of carbon you could remove is relatively limited. So it's something that is actually ready to move forward, but it won't achieve the scale of carbon removal we're ultimately going to need. Another approach that is in the biotic realm is seaweed cultivation. It sounds a lot fancier if you call it macroalgae. So, you know, if you want to get people excited, call it macroalgae if you want to get tech people involved. But cultivating seaweed, that takes carbon out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. If that biomass sinks to the deep ocean, that carbon, a good portion of it, will be sequestered and kept out of the atmosphere for a long period of time. So, but if you're massively enhancing the growth of algae in the ocean, then there clearly are potential ecological impacts of that, and we need to understand that better. Carbon removal is not the only reason to grow seaweed. It can be used for animal feed, for a source of protein, potentially as a fuel source, potentially carbon neutral fuel source. So that wouldn't be carbon removal, but it would be an alternative to, say, jet fuel, and using the biomass that's produced for a soil enhancement, or again, if it's sunk to the deep ocean, it would be a pure carbon removal approach. Third approach is ocean fertilization. This has been one that's received a lot of attention, but also controversy, particularly iron fertilization, which there have been some experiments done, not all of which have been done in under a framework of responsible approaches, and so it's really made this a very controversial area. Clearly a need for more research here to understand both the risks, but also, you know, how effective it is as a source of carbon removal. Definitely has potential because large portions of the ocean are limited in due to micronutrients like iron. So with a relatively low cost addition of iron, you potentially grow a lot more biomass. If that biomass ultimately sinks to the bottom of the ocean, it could be a very significant source of carbon removal, but clearly a lot of potential consequences to doing that need to be better understood. Now moving more towards geochemical approaches, away from biological approaches, alkalinity enhancement would involve basically grinding up rock that provides alkalinity to the ocean, can be kind of introduced in the ocean in different ways, but that could reduce acidification locally, which might have benefits, but also it changes the geochemistry of the ocean. So again, here a lot of uncertainties that need to be resolved before any kind of large-scale deployment can be considered, but definitely an area that I think is ripe for additional research and small-scale testing in the ocean. Other electrochemical processes are also possible. I think here the cost is a big question. The source of the energy to drive this process, of course, has to be considered. But another technique that's starting to get some private sector investment to see if it can be developed. Couple more quickly, artificial upwelling. Here the idea, it's kind of a mix of biogeochemical and biological, because the idea is by increasing upwelling of nutrient-rich water, you can increase the biomass production and potentially increase carbon sequestration in the ocean. What sounds similar but a different approach of artificial downwelling is recognizing that as we pump CO2 into the atmosphere and load the atmosphere up, that CO2 is being absorbed into the surface layer of the ocean. And that's where we're seeing ocean acidification, and that's only very slowly mixed with the deep ocean. If we could enhance the transport of carbon from the upper ocean to the deep ocean, that could increase the ocean sink, which is the ultimate sink for most of what humans are putting into the atmosphere anyway. So if we could accelerate that process, that's a possibility. Sounds a little nutty to me, quite frankly, because ocean is very big. So how you would actually do that at a large scale, a lot of questions there, but something that is worth looking into in our view. So just to finish up quickly on governance, countries need to develop national frameworks to govern the activities that take place, certainly within their exclusive economic zones, but also by actors that they have jurisdiction over. There are a number of codes of conduct that have been developed by the scientific community to govern the research phase, and those norms need to be fully developed and embedded in the research before we can think about large-scale deployment as we move towards uncertainty. And as I said before, we need to balance the risks of acting too fast to start using the ocean as a potential source of carbon removal and the risk of not doing enough to mitigate climate change as we think about this. We'll get into this a little more in the panel. There are existing conventions and international agreements such as the Law of the Sea, the London Dumping Convention, Convention on Biological Diversity, that are starting to say things about ocean carbon removal. They were pre-existing agreements. They weren't designed for that purpose, and we can kind of discuss to what extent that they can be effective. But ultimately, we think there needs to be a framework that's fit for purpose to govern large-scale carbon removal using the ocean as a process. So to finish up, our priorities are to expand the research agenda, make it more robust so we can start to resolve some of these big uncertainties that we have. We're not going to fully resolve them, so again, this is going to be an iterative process. We need to, in parallel, be improving our governance approach and then develop ultimately a framework that's fit for purpose to govern large-scale deployment if there's a decision that it makes sense to move forward with that in the future. So I'm going to skip that one. We just published a paper that I've been summarizing here. This is now live on the WRI website. I want to thank my colleagues, Katie Liebling and Eliza Northrup, who are the authors of that. Tough questions go to them, but I'll do my best during the Q&A. Please check it out. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dan. So this was really insightful. I have a bunch of questions I could ask you right now, but in the interest of time, I will introduce Kelly quickly. And Kelly, you've been involved with research on marine cloud brightening with the University of Washington. You serve as the Executive Director for Silver Lining NGO, which is also ensuring sort of safe science when it comes to near-term risk and climate intervention. There are some things that Dan you said which are really fantastic, which is from my perspective, we cannot achieve 1.5 without removal. Sort of, it has to happen if you really want to meet the 1.5. But then this potential exploitation at the national and local level is really very important and something that needs to be looked at. And there was a particular statement out there which said there has been so much focus on prevention rather than looking into the governance, because we need to talk about governance if this is going to work. And I think that I'm sure there are folks in the audience who probably have questions around some of those as well. So thanks a lot for sharing that with us. And we will try to make space for a Q&A conversation in the end. So Kelly, I'll hand it over to you for you to tell us the research you're involved in and your perspective when it comes to SRM as well. So yeah, take it forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joshua. I'm Kelly Wanzer, the Executive Director of Silver Lining, and we're particularly focused on the problem of near-term climate risk. So for many of you are familiar with the IPCC projections. We know that under every projection for emissions reductions and most projections for carbon removal, the Earth system will continue to warm for the next few decades. And so we're bumping up against those limitations that Joshua and Ricardo referred to with 1.5 degrees. And we're also faced with the challenge that we have some uncertainty around how the ocean and Earth system are actually responding to that heat stress. And so we have the source of the problem as greenhouse gases, but we have the direct, immediate problem of heat stress. And so there's a way in which those actually operate differently, which I'm going to talk about. But the heat stress is creating two kinds of risk for us. We have the sort of a highly uncertain risk of big abrupt changes in natural systems, what scientists have sometimes referred to as tipping points. And we've heard more in the last year or two of reports coming out of instabilities in big ice sheets, of reaching big thresholds with coral reefs, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about, and other types of tipping points like potential greenhouse gas releases from permafrost. And at the same time, as Ricardo elegantly talked about, we're seeing increased climate-linked extremes that are causing real damage and real suffering. And what we know right now is that we can anticipate that those extremes will increase with increased warming over the next few decades. So one of the questions we have is, can we do any better than that, which is where these interventions come into play. Do we have things that help us adapt? Do we have things that help us reduce warming or carbon dioxide faster to operate within this time frame where we still have warming risk baked in? And so we have different ideas happening, like trying with respect to coral reefs, where we have a pretty devastating situation that I'll talk about. We have, things happening like at localized scales where we try to see if we can adapt corals, farm corals, learn which corals are more resilient to these conditions. But as Dan referred to in some of the techniques that they looked at for carbon dioxide removal, one of the big challenges that we have with these heat stress effects is their scale. So in the Great Barrier Reef, they have a big fund to look at what different types of interventions could they make to save the reef. And you can see the state of the reef. This is a picture from a few years ago of, in the red, the reef that is basically already bleached, the at-risk in the yellow, and the green that's still operating. And you can think of the Great Barrier Reef as comparable in size, if you're familiar with the US, of the Rocky Mountains. So if we look at trying to save the barrier reef, we have a massive scale challenge in terms of the scope of that. And then if you look at the crisis for reefs around the world, it's a global problem. This is a recent chart from NOAA of the warming risk and the warming impacts on reefs. And if you've seen charts of this, from 10 or 20 years ago, they didn't used to have reefs that reached this dark red and dark orange alert level. So what we have is quite a crisis that's operating in a near-term period of time. And one of the ways we think about it, sorry about the formatting on the chart, is what are the interventions that we can make that operate at the required scale to influence warming within the sort of mid-century time horizon, that 30-year time horizon. And so scientists look at that question, and there were a couple of studies in 2012 in the UK and 2015 in the United States where they asked the question of, if you needed to reduce warming quickly within a decade or a few years, if you had the capability, what are the most promising options for research? And where they landed is one of the ways that the Earth system regulates the heat energy within it, which is the reflection of sunlight from clouds and particles in the atmosphere. And what you're seeing here is a picture of a cloud deck off the Pacific West Coast. And the brightness of those clouds is influenced by the composition of the atmosphere and the particles within it. And what you're seeing right here, the bright streaks in the clouds, those are actually made from the particulates in emissions from ships. And so today we have ships and other sources of particulate pollution that are influencing the atmosphere in a way that at scale, collectively, they're making the atmosphere a little bit brighter. And at scale, collectively, they're offsetting some of the warming that would otherwise be produced by greenhouse gas trapped energy. And this is a IPCC chart. It's actually from AR5, because that's a better graphic that I had. But this shows the warming and cooling effects of various anthropogenic sources. And the blue that you see is the cooling effect that's estimated to be generated by particles in the atmosphere from pollution. You can also see those little spider bars that effect is highly uncertain. In fact, the IPCC has called it out as the largest source of uncertainty in near-term climate. And so what I'm going to talk to you about right now in terms of Joshua's question, Ricardo's question about 1.5, about how we protect the ocean from impacts, and what people are thinking about is the idea that scientists have put forward that said trying to look at this technique in a clean and controlled way to slightly increase the reflection of sunlight by the atmosphere may be an option. We don't know, but we think that it's really important to do the research. And so there's a little bit of research happening in the world, and the picture that you're seeing here is a picture of a spray system that's starting down the path of researching one of these techniques. And the technique is based on the ship track picture that I showed you, except that here what you're seeing is they're using a sea salt spray taken from seawater and made into a microfine mist in an effort to study what it would look like to put that sea salt mist into regions of clouds. And in this case, what you're seeing is this project is undertaken near the Great Barrier Reef by the Australian Barrier Reef Fund to start to study the question of what that might look like and whether you could understand what happened when the particles come out of that sprayer into the marine environment, and you could plug that into models that might tell you what might happen downstream. And so if you look at Ricardo's problem of what's happening in Honduras, some scientists have put forward, like they're working on in the Great Barrier Reef, that you might use this sort of cloud misting technique as an approach to cooling the local environment or the circulation pathways into the local environment to do things like prevent coral bleaching or reduce these current-related bleaching events, or to do things like cool the ocean areas in the regions of the development of storms. And what I'll say to you about this right now, our level of knowledge today is very low, and our level of research funding is very low. But in terms of the options that we have to start to address these kinds of questions, this is where scientists have landed in terms of what's promising for research. And this low marine cloud idea also has a potential to reduce global temperature, at least in some scientists' opinion, because if you were to cool clouds in certain regions of the world where the right kinds of clouds exist, you might be able to offset by cooling regions that represent about 4 to 5% of the surface of the ocean, offset a doubling of CO2 or a couple of degrees of warming. And again, I'll say there's a lot of unknowns to this. And also, with respect to how people have looked at these questions before, they've been looking at the analogs in the natural world and what they've seen. And so the most prominent form of this sunlight reflection effect that people have talked about is increasing the reflection of sunlight from particles in the outer layer of the atmosphere, the stratosphere. And this has been observed before when Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991. And what you're seeing here is a chart of the global temperatures and the observation that after Mount Pinatubo erupted, there was a drop in global average temperature of about 0.5 degrees C. And that persisted as these particles from the volcano remained in the outer layer of the atmosphere for a period of time. And one of the effects related to the ocean environment was that what they observed after the volcano was a recovery of ice in the Arctic region. And so you're seeing the history of the Arctic ice record there. So in terms of research and study, scientists believe that they've observed and they understand the cooling effects of this particular type of approach to reducing global average temperature and reaching 1.5 degree targets. What they don't know is what the side effects of that might be over a sustained period of time. That would be a really important thing to know. And from the perspective of our organization and the stakeholders that we work with, they're really interested in pursuing research on that question so that we can get clear answers that are shared in an open way, and where there's collaboration with scientists from different parts of the world to look at these questions closely and with very clear eyes. So we are also in the camp that the other panelists have been talking about in terms of the importance of research. And one thing that I'll say is that what we've found in our organization over the past few years working on this is that climate research investments, the research side of climate, has been flat for several decades. So we've seen recently, and very optimistically, investments in reducing emissions, but we still have a challenge to increase our investments in our observations and understanding of the ocean systems and the climate and atmospheric systems that pertain to these questions. So we spend a lot of energy doing that, and one of the reasons that we do is regarding Dan's comments about, do we have the information that we need for the type of governance, the type of understanding, the type of dialogue that we need to have about whether or not these proposed approaches might be helpful. And so, we think that in terms of climate justice and in terms of these questions of protection for people and human life, that the research in these areas is quite important, and it's a significant time for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. So I have questions, and we still have two people that, who are with us today. So we have Nishan, who is joining us virtually, and thanks for your patience in waiting. Happy to have you here. So Nishan is the director for Exo Solutions, but most of his career has been focusing on leveraging technology and serving as an advisor to institutions who are looking at leveraging technology to advance ocean health. And we also have Dan with us, who also is a professor at the Arizona State University and really focuses on international environmental law. I have questions, and I'm sure that you have questions. I'll just try to get two of my questions in, and I'll really turn over to you, and you can get your questions to the panel so we can have a healthy conversation here. I will start with you, Nishan, because you, from a technology perspective, you've heard all of this. And I'm wondering, because you come from Mauritius, and I'm wondering if you think of a country like Mauritius, small island, developing states, what do you see as a role for such countries in this? Because Kelly rightfully mentioned that we need sort of research and a bit of the governance and leadership to also come from a global south perspective. And I'm wondering if there are already conversations like this happening in Mauritius, from your advisory role to companies and countries, if there's a global south sort of element and leadership already coming up.
Yes, thank you, Joshua, and apologies I cannot be there in person, and it's been a very engaging panel so far. One of the big areas that I've led in Mauritius for the previous 10 years is how do you reframe many of these small island states as large ocean states? And rather than looking from a position of weakness and victim, where are the opportunities? Right, we know that over the next 2 or 3 decades, we are going to see a green industrial revolution, a blue industrial revolution. Some of the technologies that Kelly has mentioned are going to open up tremendous new potential. Right, there will be jobs in 10 years' time for the high school students graduating that do not exist today. And we're only just on the start of a new type of artificial intelligence. So some of you may have heard of generative AI, DALL-E and Stable Diffusion. We are about to see a huge amount of new artificial intelligence that will open up and disrupt the way that we do research and science as well. And so when I look at that, I say there are tremendous opportunities here. And so how can the Global South play a role in that? Play a role in 3 areas. Number one, identifying those economic opportunities of the future. If you have a large ocean area like Mauritius, 4 times the size of France, what could you do with a country that is 99% underwater? Number two, in terms of the sensors, data is going to be the new currency of how we will actually develop some of our models. And so how can you incorporate new sensors that can contribute to these global models, and what economic opportunities can be created as a result? And then number 3, from a scientist and human capital perspective, What are we doing at our primary school, high school, and university level to empower our scientists, not with traditional PhD level education, but what does, what does micro learning do? What does AI enhanced or micro courses do? Coding and synthetic biology. There are a range of new techniques that we need to incorporate and radically transform our school curriculum. And I think that's critical for any country in the global south to start thinking about that and looking at a world in 2030 where there are leapfrog opportunities rather than following the traditional path.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it makes me want to ask if there are already accessibility to this knowledge and skills, because you talk about the jobs that will come from high school students today. And I'm wondering if a high school student in Mauritius, Ghana, Nigeria, Honduras, if they want to pursue a career in this, will they have access to that in their countries? And I think that is a bigger question as well. But thanks for pointing out in that direction. Dan, a lot of questions came up on governance, and you are the international environmental law expert here. So I'm going to leave it to you. What do you see as the ways that we can really move forward in terms of the governance piece around this, such that we can avoid the exploitation of local and national level when talking about ocean carbon removals, but anything that would also help us move from the prevention of talking about this in general to acting on it, but having a good governance structure in place.
Well, thanks very much. I think there's a widespread misperception that there's no governance of the ocean. There is governance of the ocean. It's called the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which has been called the Constitution for the Ocean. And the UN Convention for the Law of the Sea sets out a pretty comprehensive governance structure, and I just want to emphasize two elements of it in particular. The first is it sets forth a comprehensive set of provisions dealing with prevention of marine pollution, which are relevant to all of these different techniques involving marine climate intervention. So states have an obligation to preserve and protect the marine environment. They have an obligation to assess activities that might affect the marine environment, to monitor those activities, to consult with other states. All of these would apply to marine climate interventions, to marine cloud brightening, to ocean fertilization, and so forth. So we do have a governance structure setting forth a broad array of environmental principles that would apply to all of these different ocean activities. The other point I wanted to mention is I agree with everything earlier speakers said about the importance of research. We need a lot more research on these kinds of marine interventions. And the Law of the Sea Convention actually is very supportive of marine scientific research. It has a whole section on marine scientific research which puts an obligation on states to promote marine scientific research, to cooperate on that research. And it actually sets forth a structure for cooperation where countries are supposed to be collaborating with each other. The research is supposed to be transparent, information sharing. So I think we actually have the elements for a governance structure involving both environmental protection, the importance of marine scientific research, and collaboration on that research, so involving not just one country, but all countries around the world. I think the issue right now for me is all of these obligations are supposed to be implemented by states. And so I think the focus really needs to be more on national governance, states actually asserting jurisdiction over activities within their control, to make sure that these various provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention are actually satisfied. I just mentioned one other thing in relation to ocean fertilization. So there's a separate regime sort of subsumed under the Law of the Sea Convention, but independent of it, the London Convention and Protocol, which has tried to begin to address ocean fertilization in particular. That's not a binding regime. It's only been recommendatory so far, but that is a more specific treaty regime dealing with ocean fertilization in particular.
Thank you very much. So there is some sort of a governance existing, but the capacity at the national level to really get this moving. And Kelly, you did mention the Montreal Protocol as an opportunity. I'm going to come back to you on that. But for now, I'll turn to our audience. So please, go ahead. You introduce yourself quickly, and you fire the question through. Yeah.
My name's Alex. I'm from Canada. First of all, Ricardo, thank you so much. That was one of the most invigorating presentations I've seen the entire conference, so thank you. This has been a super impressive panel, and I'm going to ask you a question that comes from sitting through several OCDR panels. I had to look up what OCDR meant. And I'm really divided with this for a few reasons. One, the whole notion of putting more carbon dioxide into the ocean when we're talking about acidification being a major problem. But in the context of this panel and the discussions that we're having, as we talk about sort of how the global south can seize these opportunities, how do we do this in a way that the global south doesn't become the guinea pig of the ocean? How do we do it in a way where we're not exploiting countries unclose? And I think just drawing on the sort of ISA example is not doing a good job of engaging global south and large ocean states. So how do we ensure that we don't just force the global south into a crisis where there's all sorts of crazy experiments happening and devastating consequences?
Thank you so much. That's a very excellent question. Kelly, you want to take that?
We work on research and particularly interested in international research capacities. So the way we think about this question is we collaborate on a peer level with scientific experts from different parts of the world. And the problem that we encountered is that they lack research capacity both in funding and in the technical resources required to do the work, like high performance computing, access to machine learning and data science experts, and things like that. And so one of the important aspects that we think for these things to work and be effective in a truly equitable way, a truly just way, is that you have to have local experts working on the science who can advise their own people about the realities for their regions. Right now, they're really still in a position where it's a lot of secondhand science. They don't design the studies, they don't decide what gets looked at, and they're at a disadvantage out of the gate. So at least one of the elements has to be, and we think it's important for both nation states and philanthropy to really think about scientific capacity for peer experts in the global south to get stood up on these capabilities quickly so they can participate too.
Thanks a lot. I think, Nishan, you wanted to come in quickly on this. Please do, yeah.
Yeah, and just on a quick one, I think, so I agree fully with what Kelly has said, but it's also, let's take a 10-year approach, right? This is going to be a 10-year journey. And if you think about scientists, I know we've got some youth scientists here, but if we think about scientists who are under 30 today, they have more power, more access to their cell phone than had more power than that went to the moon on the Apollo missions. And so you start on that 10-year journey, invest in them now, as Kelly has said, give that capacity, and then by 2030, as things become critical, they will be empowered to make informed decisions. They will find new discoveries that we haven't thought about right now, new economic opportunities for their countries. But start with that 10-year journey, get a lot more younger people involved early on and invest in that in a radical way of research, education, and capacity building.
Thank you, Nishan. All right, I'll just call out 2 more questions, and I'll allow the panel to answer that and give your final remarks as well. Time is wrapping up. So who wants to go? Okay, there's a hand there, please. Oh, okay, there was one here. Okay, right, and then there.
Well, Michael, Amanda Ellis from Hawaii. We're seeing coral bleaching too, so this has been such a valuable panel. Thank you. I have an offer. The Ellen Atlas, which is part of Arizona State University's Global Airborne Observatory, has now mapped all of the world's top shallow coral reefs. So 18 months ago, only 1% were mapped. They're all mapped now, and so there's a possibility to predict these bleaching events. So please have a look at the atlas. It's freely available online, and hopefully it will be very useful. Second question is around wood carbon credits. The first have been done by the Government of Colombia and Conservation International using mangroves and seagrasses. And now with satellite technology, we're able to better map that CO2. We understand that mangroves embed much more CO2 than similar trees on land. What do you think the capacity and possibility of scaling up, given that they're community-based solutions, they return money to communities in the global south? Do you think we can go to scale with this now that it's been proven after this 4-year trial period?
Thank you very much. And then we will take question from here, and I'll turn over to the panel to respond and wrap up. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Jim O'Donnell. I'm a professor at the University of Connecticut. My point, I think, is getting permission to do even a modest experiment on CO2 concentration enriching the water possible. And there is a serious obstacle associated with governance. I know that there are rules, there are no mechanics, there's no process that's got a clear endpoint. And establishing one would allow at least some highly scaled things to be funded in the next year. That's really what's necessary. Other things are going to take 10 years to scale up, and we've got to do a better job of that, equitable, including the local service sector. But what we really need right now is someone that can say, let's allow that experiment for a limited time, or a limited period under certain conditions, and that way it can get funded.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. Thanks for that very absolutely brilliant question. So one on everyone checking out mapping of the corals. I think that's great. And then the second one, how do we finance? Is blue carbon credits the way to go? Do you think that? And I think very important point, if you want to scale and avoid prevention, there has to be permission to carry out some sort of research. How do we unlock that? So I will allow all of you to go, say your final words, respond to some of the questions if you can, and I'll wrap up. So I'll start with you, Dan.
So thanks. So I think it's a huge problem that you point to right now, and Kelly and I wrote a paper about developing a model national research program to basically make it easier, to set a framework of responsible governance of marine geoengineering that would then enable researchers like yourself to be able to apply and get permission and get a social license to go ahead with the research. So I think getting some kind of national research programs going is essential, and that would make it easier then to get that permission.
Well, I'll follow on that theme and say to both questions about the blue carbon and the research pathway is that, to help reorient thinking about what research is for. It's often confused with project development in these categories. But it really looks more like environmental protection research, where we need to understand what these things do when they're emitted into the environment, whether we're doing it on purpose or as a side effect of other activity. And we need to do those very small scale experiments to be able to understand and project what the large scale things would be. So we really need to better differentiate between research and project development in categories like ocean fertilization and other things. And then I think, we'll get closer to what you're talking about of being able to define a clear pathway.
Yeah, I guess I'll just comment on the blue carbon question. We see real value in blue carbon initiatives. I think it's important to separate the question of whether it has carbon removal potential. It has some. It has massive co-benefits for the communities where it's done. And then there's a separate question of how to finance it. So there's a whole set of issues around carbon markets and guardrails for how carbon markets can be used constructively. WRI participates as one of the co-founders of the Science-Based Target Initiative. So we have some recommendations around that, which basically require companies with a science-based target to do 90% of the work in their own value chain before they turn to carbon markets as a supplementary measure. And similarly, California this year passed a law that said it actually put a net zero target for 2045 into law, and said that 85% of the effort to do that, at least 85% of the emission reductions to achieve that, have to be direct emission reduction from sources. The remaining 15% could be carbon removal, whether ocean or land-based. And I think that kind of framework keeps the emphasis on making sure that carbon removal or carbon credits are not a substitute for emission reductions from core value chains of companies or from country targets. And that kind of framework is what we need.
Thanks, everyone. It's really been an honor. So really quickly, yes, I said it. Conservation without funding is conversation. We agree on that. But also, let's not fall into carbon colonialism. That's my worry when we're talking about carbon markets, because a lot of countries are relying on countries like mine, are paying pennies by the bucket for what they're doing, and in a sense, this is not going to give away the actual work that needs to be done in climate mitigation. So just a quick thought there, but carbon colonialism is a big thing, and it is something that we need to address. And to your point there, yes, I agree, there are challenges, but at least a very personal note here is that I see a lot of talk about what would happen with a small experiment from now and then, but I don't see any talk about what happened to Honduras already with our 2 hurricanes. I don't see a lot of talk about what happened back to us on 1998, where we had to hit the reset button completely for our economy. So yes, we do have to think about side effects. We have to think about these challenges, but also let's not forget that this is already happening in the global south. We need solutions, and we need them now. And let us not stop us from having these important conversations and addressing these important challenges as soon as possible to keep 1.5 alive. Thanks, everyone.
Nishan, quickly.
Yeah, and just the last comment. I think, on the financing side, it's a challenging macroeconomic environment, so it's hard to expect there'll be a lot of government grants. But as Dan said, there are some very innovative finance mechanisms. Things like advanced purchase orders, for example, of what's required for zero-emission vehicles. Looking at the power of fintech, we are transitioning to a new model of financial markets. So what are the green or blue fintech opportunities? So I think if we get finance people in the room, talk about those opportunities, we'll see a whole spectrum from kind of blue and green VCs through to asset holders and a range of new financial products that will define our financial landscape. And who knows, by 2030, we may see a ocean bank of sustainability of the future that may hold, let's say, marine DNA, for example. That could be a new asset class. So that's my aspiration and hope for the future.
Thank you very much, Nishan. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to you for participating. I think it's what I would say to close this is that I believe that 1.5 is possible, and we need to keep that hope alive. And, we know that it's not going to be possible without carbon removal, so we need to start looking into that. And instead of preventing the conversation around that, we need to start looking at how to make it possible, and that involves funding for research, funding for global South skills and development around that. And Nishan, you said something which I really like. It's not this framing of small island developing state. They are not small. They are really the ones holding the ocean. So if you talk about ocean carbon removal, they are big stakeholders, and they should be seen as that. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you can keep the conversation going from here.